So let's begin without a delay. And our first panelist is Semih Gokatalay from the University of California, San Diego, originally from Middle East Technical University in Ankara. And he is a PhD candidate, very close to finishing, at the History Department. His dissertation explores the economic and business history of the Middle East during the transition from the Ottoman Empire to nation states. Please, Semih.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor. And let me open the slides first. And 5, 4, 3, file and show and from the beginning. Hello, everyone. And I want to start my presentation with a quote from Bernard Lewis himself. In his book, The Jews of Islam, Lewis wrote that, quote, "The propagation of anti-Semitic themes and notions was not left to chance, nor was it entirely entrusted to Middle Eastern enterprises. Anti-Semitism has been energetically propagated by various European groups, and the most important in the last century, were the Nazis, who from the early 1930s until the defeat of Germany in 1945 devoted great efforts to the spread of anti-Semitic doctrines among the Arabs." End of quote. My presentation shows the propagation of anti-Semitic themes through public gatherings, chiefly fairs and festivals, at national and international levels in the interwar Middle East. I argue that fairs did not only reflect growing anti-Semitism, but also accentuated anti-Jewish discourses between the two world wars. There were two opposite trends at work in this period. On the one hand, this period witnessed a new rise of anti-Semitic upsurge and the increase in the number of legal acts that excluded Jews from the business world in general and trade fairs in particular, and throughout Europe, which found an echo in the Middle East as well. On the other hand, the same period witnessed Jewish immigration between European countries, as well as from Europe and the United States to mandatory Palestine, which facilitated the existence of Jewish groups at international gatherings. This study differs from most historical studies on anti-Semitism and Jewish communities in the Middle East. Why? Because with its focus on multi-country relations and interactions between the Middle East and Europe, it presents a transnational account of anti-Semitism. Through an analysis of the nexus between public gatherings and anti-Semitism in the region in the Middle East, it takes a step toward placing the region into a comparative transnational framework. It consults archival material and newspapers in different languages from both the regional countries and the Western world. In addition, it engages with studies on European and Middle Eastern Jews to better contextualize the specific case of fairs and festivals within the context of or within the scheme of anti-Semitism. When all of these sources are consulted, they reveal that the characteristics of anti-Semitism in the Middle East significantly change in the interwar period with the impetus of Nazi ideology. Neither anti-Semitic occurrences nor public campaigns against Jews in the Middle East were new in the interwar periods. Ottoman Jews regularly celebrated their festivals such as the Passover or Yom Kippur with public ceremonies. These celebrations contributed to the gradual formation of a new identity in the old Yishuv. Festivals, Jewish or non-Jewish, still provided fertile ground for anti-Semites to throw stones at Jews and murder them collectively on religious grounds. The Ottoman government undertook a series of basic measures against the protection of its Jewish subjects and warned the head of Christian communities not to oppress Jews during these celebrations. Greek Orthodox festivals were particularly full of anti-Jewish verbal and physical attacks. Burning the puppets or the icon of Jew at the Easter festival, for example, was a widespread practice throughout the Middle East. The Ottoman government strictly prohibited this practice because it offended Jews and exaggerated or exacerbated intracommunal tensions between Greek Orthodox and Jewish groups or Jewish Ottomans in general. The government banned even the exhibit of any material that mocked Jews in the public space. However, these measures did not stop anti-Semitic attacks. As the interwar period added further momentum to anti-Semitism at public meetings, the attitude of political authorities against anti-Semites radically changed. Not only did the leaders of the former Ottoman countries tolerate violence and exclusion against Jews at fairs and festivals, but also anti-Semites enjoyed the full support of local and central governors on many occasions. When we look at the European fairs, we can see the history of restrictive measures against Jews at European fairs ran very deep. Jewish merchants took a very active part in commercial gatherings both in the urban centers and rural areas since the Middle Ages. Nationalism and worsening economic conditions in the continent increased anti-Semitic outbreaks in the late 19th century. Despite increasing nationalism and anti-Jewish sentiments, European fairs were more inclusive in the 1920s than their pre-war counterparts within a legal perspective. Zionist groups particularly took advantage of such meetings, international meetings, to organize their conventions and congresses and promote their policies and agendas. The Great Depression, and more importantly, the Nazi seizure of power in Germany, however, profoundly changed this picture. The Leipzig Fair exemplified this alteration. Jews had maintained a well-established presence in the host city in Leipzig for centuries. The Nazi seizure of power not only increased the discrimination against Jews at the fair, but also transformed the nature of exclusion. Generally speaking, religion was replaced by racist ideas in the anti-Semitic rhetoric, even though the religious side of this question was not easy to be divorced by the race. The fair was open only a few weeks after Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933. Over time, a series of discriminatory laws in Germany adversely affected Jewish participation in German fairs. Nazis furthered their exclusions year by year, which later applied to foreign nations as well, and they eventually banned Jewish participation altogether and forbade even the exhibits that Jews contributed to their production, including all foreign nationals. When we look at the Middle East in the same period, we can see that public gatherings assume new importance for anti-Jewish discourses in Palestine since the beginning of the British rule, as tension ran often between Arabs and Jews. The Jerusalem riots, which stem from Arab opposition to the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the perceived emerging dominance of Zionism in the country, illustrated this change. The riots began during the Nabi Musar festival, which was a popular Muslim religious celebration. Nonetheless, such meetings, such gatherings brought Arabs and Jews together in the 1920s. The Zionist-led exhibitions and fairs in Haifa, Jaffa, and Tel Aviv shaped Arab-Jewish relations in the early years of the mandate. These meetings drew both Arabs and Jewish sellers and spectators in this period. The popular festivals of Purim and Passover complemented the role of exhibitions and fairs in bringing Arabs and Jews together. The relatively harmonious relationship between Arabs and Jews in public gatherings, however, gradually waned in the 1930s. As with other aspects of mandatory Palestine, fairs turned into increasingly polarized place between these two groups, with unsettling implications for the future of the country. From a practical perspective, the group of Tel Aviv jeopardized Arab interests, particularly in Jaffa. The Zionists claimed that the fair, the Levant Fair, represented the entire country, met considerable resistance from Arab leaders, who repeated the assertion that Arabs were excluded from the Zionist Fair or Al-Marid al-Sihuni. Eventually, the Levant Fair was boycotted by certain Arab leaders. At the same time, Arab leaders organized two Arab fairs in Jerusalem in 1933 and 1934, in which Jewish exhibitors were not allowed to display their products. Though Palestinian Arabs did not participate in the Levant Fair in the mid-1930s, and the last one was in 1936, they contributed to its outcome. It was no coincidence that the boycott of the Levant Fair became part of the Arab revolt of the late 1930s. As an international meeting, the fair provided fertile ground for Arabs to make their case to the world. They work hard to undermine the vitality of the fair. Arab workers, for example, at the Jaffa port went on a strike and refused to carry exhibits to Tel Aviv. They also prevented the transfer of Jewish workers by beating them. The rioters set a fire at the fairgrounds and destroyed certain parts of the stadium and pavilion of the Histadrut. And Jewish workers and British troops extinguished the fire eventually and prevented the landing bridge from burning down. Security forces also detected a time bomb that was planted at the fairgrounds that could have killed hundreds of spectators. The tensions surfacing in trade fairs in Palestine were not limited to this country. Instead, other former Ottoman countries in the Middle East directly and indirectly took part in the anti-Jewish campaign to a certain extent, or to varying degrees. The Levant Fair, as the largest commercial gathering in the British and French Middle East in the interwar period, was not immune to the lure of Arab nationalism and particularly Pan-Arabism. Although all Arab countries had participated in the fair in the 1920s, they boycotted it with the exception of Lebanon in the mid-1930s. Indeed, nationalists prevented the transfer of goods and commodities from Lebanon and Syria to Palestine at the time of the Levant Fair. It is important to note that such campaigns in the Arab world were solely against neither the issue nor Zionists. Instead, they targeted Jewish residents or citizens of their own countries as well. For example, when a new commercial and industrial exhibition was opened in Baghdad, all Arab countries were invited. Since the exhibition was planned as a purely Arab event, Iraqi Jews and their counterparts in surrounding countries refrained from displaying their samples. Likewise, in collaboration with Arab nations in Palestine, Arab nationals in Syria made efforts for the participation of Palestinian Arabs in the Damascus Fair in the 1936, the biggest fair in this country at that time. Jewish residents of Syria and surrounding countries felt threatened due to the growing tensions between Arabs and Jews in this period. Indeed, during the Damascus Fair, Syrian Arab nationalists made demonstrations to boycott the Levant Fair and forced merchants in the Jewish quarter of Damascus to close their shops. Consequently, not only the Arab Fair in Jerusalem, but also commercial meetings in other Arab countries provided fertile ground for the dissemination of anti-Jewish ideas and sentiments. This presentation has provided a transnational account of anti-Semitism in the Arab world and the Middle East in general, as experienced through fairs and festivals in the interwar period. There is no doubt that anti-Jewish discrimination in these meetings had deep roots in the Middle East. And nonetheless, it was mostly Christians, not Muslims, who attacked Jews at such meetings in the late Ottoman Empire. More importantly, the Ottoman state put in place special security measures to protect its Jewish subjects and try to catch and punish those who attacked, mocked, and offended Jewish citizens or Jewish subjects. With the collapse of the empire and the shifting political landscape of the region, however, Jews began to be attacked, excluded, and discriminated at public gatherings, usually under the guidance or support of certain political leaders. This time, however, it was mostly Muslims who harbored major anti-Jewish sentiments at fairs under the guidance of political leaders such as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. These expressions of hostility and violence took on a particular dimension in the 1930s, which was a direct outcome of the rise of Nazis in Germany and the subsequent growth of their power in the post-Ottoman world. We can see the use of several Nazi symbols, as well, such as swastika, in the Levant Fair, which was perceived as a Jewish commercial meeting. To conclude, while religious identities played an important role in the emergence and continuation of anti-Semitism at fairs prior to the First World War, the emphasis on ethnicity and race gained momentum in the interwar period in parallel with the rise of Nazis in the same era. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Fairs sometimes are not so fair. Our next speaker is Noha Mellor, is a professor in media at the University of Sharjah and visiting professor at Bournemouth University and at Stockholm University. She is the author of numerous books about Arab media, including most recently Arab Digital Journalism, published this year.
made for people. Okay. Okay, so just a very brief thing about myself, because I'm native Egyptian, but I left Egypt 28 years ago. And I lived in Denmark first for 10 years and then 18 years in London. And now I have moved to the UAE 2 months ago. So don't know where's the next stop. So my paper, by the way, I mean, my presentation is based on a paper that I presented and to ISGAP conference, Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And it was presented in Cambridge. Was it August, I think? I think August, yeah. Yes. Right before I moved to the UAE. And the extended paper should be printed out in or appear in ISGAP forthcoming volume. Okay, so there has been an increase in studies dealing with the representation of Jews in cinema and drama, but there is a paucity of studies that examine Arab representation of the Jews. And my presentation touches on the representation of the Jewish character as constructed in Egyptian drama and cinema. The focus is not so much on the accuracy of historical events depicted in this dramatic representation, but on the connections made between this representation and the degree of sympathy or hostility towards the Jews. Now, popular culture provides one influential ideological apparatus in the Arab region, and through this apparatus, ideologies are reproduced and reinforced. Film and drama, therefore, provide rich material for research on the construction and reconstruction of a distant other, stereotypically depicted as the villain. Stereotypes of Jews range from classic anti-Semitic themes depicting Jews as the origin of moral decay and evil, with the overall aim of controlling the world, to portraying Jews as harboring inherent hatred towards Muslims in particular. And this form of stereotyping is categorized as anti-Semitism, defined as a certain perception of Jews as the cause of all wars in the world. It can be expressed in various forms of discourse, including popular culture, which aims to dehumanize and demonize the Jews. I focus on Egyptian entertainment industry for many reasons. First, Egyptian cinema is the oldest and largest in the region, where many actually Jewish actors and directors managed to profile themselves during the first few decades of the industry. And second, popular media genre, such as films and drama, television drama, reach most Arab households, unlike literature or fine arts, which are mainly accessible by the educated elites. And third, Egypt, which signed the peace treaty with Israel in 1979 to normalize relations, has not had a direct military conflict with Israel for many decades, unlike, for instance, Syria, or Lebanon, where the representation of Jews may be directly influenced by ongoing political tension with Israel. Now, my paper draws on Roger Silverstone's concept of a proper distance between us and the other. The ideal distance for Silverstone is the capacity to enlarge one's perspective and the willingness to recognize the other in her sameness and difference. So if the distance gets too far, the risk is representing the other as beyond the pale of humanity. And I argue that the selected films and dramas, which I'm going to show you a few examples of, reflect the difficulty of maintaining that proper distance to the other. And this misrepresentation ultimately aims to guide the audience's feeling towards the Jews and the Israelis. And this approach helps to unravel the power in media representation of the Jews by presenting them as morally corrupt and evil by nature compared to the Arabs. Now, following the 1952 military coup in Egypt, this distance diminished, giving President Nasser's active policy to uproot Jewish communities from Egypt, causing the massive immigration of Jews. And the succession of Sadat, during that period of Sadat's rule, there were several films made to glorify the Egyptian military performance in 1973 war, while during Mubarak's era, a rapidly growing number of films and television series were made to glorify the Egyptian intelligence service vis-à-vis their Israeli counterparts. The latter period, Mubarak's period, I argue, has amplified the distance to the other, often depicting Jewish and Israeli characters as evil and malicious by nature, and there has been some effort to redraw the distance to the other post-2011 with an attempt to redefine the status of Arab Jews who were expelled or had to flee Arab countries in mid-20th century. Now, going back a little bit to the beginning, following the 1948 war and until basically mid-60s, thousands of Jewish families were either compelled to leave Arab states such as Egypt or left voluntarily to escape the hostility of the post-independent regime, like in Egypt, because that regime questioned the loyalty of Egyptian Jewry. And cities like Alexandria, of course, changed status from being a cosmopolitan state hosting foreign minorities, including Jewish communities, cast as loyal to colonial interests. The Jewish population of Egypt during the 30s and the 40s was said to be around 80,000, but around 20,000 of them left in the wake of the 1948 war, and many more left for Europe, the US, or Israel following the 1956 Suez War. Those who stayed, however, had to prove their loyalty to their Arab societies, and many of the synagogues were deserted, sold, or declared as monuments. And today there are only fewer than 10 Jewish people left in Egypt, and the rest has long slipped from the national memory. So the Jewish communities once made a major contribution to Egyptian cinema and performing arts in general, and there were numerous other Jews who were profiled as singers, musicians, actors on the silver screen. Following the 1952 coup and the Free Officers' rise to power, efforts were made to devalue the contribution of Jews to Egyptian cinema during the 30s and the 40s by representing films made during that period as being of little value to the history of Egyptian cinema. In the meantime, certain Islamist societies, such as the Muslim Brotherhood movement, promoted anti-Semitic discourses based on Islamizing the Palestinian issue in support of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Jerusalem Mufti, who wrote to the Brotherhood stating that the battle was not between Zionism and the Palestinians, as he said, but about Islam itself. And there are numerous examples from Muslim Brotherhood publications, which I discuss separately in a different book called Voice of the Muslim Brotherhood, where I trace their history through their media from 1928 until 2013. So you can read it if you want. Now, following the Arab defeat in the 1967 war, a new call emerged to record the destructive impact of the defeat on the Egyptian and Arab psyche. And Sadat's regime directed cinematic productions to glorify the Egyptian military's performance in the 1973 war under his leadership as a means of regaining a national pride. And there was just a couple of films made during that time, but this kind of production was to rapidly increase during Mubarak's era. The number of Egyptian films and television series dealing with the so-called Zionist conspiracy multiplied during Mubarak's rule. They focused on the representation of Jews and Israel as the major problem that threatened Arab societies, while disconnecting the Jewish character from the Arab region as well as the West, and confining its loyalty to the State of Israel. And the period between 1980s and basically the early decade of this century marked a strong interest in featuring the Jewish-Arab relationship and the espionage, the so-called espionage war in Egyptian drama and films. There are numerous examples that I discuss in the paper, but one of them is featured here. It's called Ra'fat al-Haggan, broadcast first time in 1987 during Ramadan, which is a high season for Egyptian drama, but now also for Syrian and Gulf drama. And it tells the story of a spy, Egyptian spy, who was allegedly planted in Israel for 20 years. And it was broadcast over 2 seasons, over 2 years, and initiated a heated debate after Israeli media published reports that that guy actually was a double agent. And there were other series and films which dealt with cases from the 60s, like Spy War. The director of it, called Nader Galal, he defended the obsession, as he called it, with espionage by saying, and I'm quoting him, "It's our right to present drama that glorifies our Egyptian intelligence, and the development of the Israeli-Egyptian relations do not change the history of the excellent work of the Egyptian intelligence in penetrating the Israeli internal security," end of quote. There was another series called Don't Fear, which is another example of adding to this distance to the other. And it's about a Muslim journalist who insists on disclosing the Zionist plans, as he called it. And this puts him under great pressure, especially when a character out of the blue reveals the secret about that Muslim journalist by revealing that he actually has Jewish ancestry. The most notorious of such blockbuster series was that one, Horseman Without a Horse, broadcast in Egypt and many other Arab countries in Ramadan 2002, resulting in a political diplomatic conflict between Egypt and Israel. The series was produced by the Egyptian satellite channel Dream TV, and it dealt with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a work published in Russia in the early 20th century. And the protocols, of course, were highly contested as a hoax, disseminated only to stir anti-Jewish sentiments in Russia at that time. And even an Egyptian historian specialized in Israeli affairs called Abdel Wahab al-Misiri, he appeared on television, and he wrote also that that work, the protocols, were basically a hoax and can't be validated by any historical evidence or research. Now, the series was broadcast on 17 Arab channels, and the Israeli objection to the series was described by an Egyptian editor as, and I'm quoting him, "a barbaric attack on Egyptian and Arab art." On the other hand, another editor saw the series as, and I'm quoting him, "yet another commercial attempt to greedily invest in our national issues, a phenomenon we have seen in many superficial movies or series, where a scene of the Israeli flag being burned and imposed to provoke the audience into a frenzy of exaggerated applause." On the silver screen, Jews and Israelis were mostly depicted as deceitful, characterized as seductive women, for instance, in a movie called Love and Taba from 1992. And there are many other examples that I mentioned in my paper, and I don't want to kind of waste more time on it. But one critic, I'm quoting in the paper, he said that there is a dilemma for filmmakers in Egypt in either depicting a neutral image of the Jewish character and upsetting critics and commentators, or depicting a false image that could easily be refuted by Egyptians who experienced dealings with Israelis in Egypt. But anyway, these depictions tend to blame all social ills on Israel and the Jews. There was another film featured here, but again, I don't have time for it, I believe. I don't. Okay, I'm moving on. And there was another episode, another series, made in 2010 and ran again in 2011. And as I mentioned, the discourse, anti-Semitic discourse, disseminated as well by Islamist movements like the Brotherhood, but the danger was that it also kind of distributed via mainstream Islamic institutions like Al-Azhar. And I mentioned these examples in my other book, Voice of the Muslim Brotherhood. Meanwhile, Mubarak, for instance, joined Israel and Jordan in trade deals, which and this politically motivated stance created a complete dissonance between Egypt's internal and foreign policies, rather than, synchronizing the principles underpinning both sets of policies. So this kind of discourse targeting Jews is regarded as a form of knowledge generated by the political, religious, and cultural elites who see themselves as more capable of handling the relations with Israel, while discouraging the general population from engaging in any meaningful relationships with Israelis. And the irony is that not any of these elites regarded themselves as racists or anti-Semitic, yet they allowed the spread of this anti-Semitic myth that was based on a powerful Jewish conspiracy to rule the world. As I said, post-2011, there were a handful of positive representations of Jews, like a documentary called Jews of Egypt, directed by Egyptian director Amir Ramses in 2012. And it tells the story of the lives of Egyptian Jewish community during the first half of the 20th century until their exodus after 1956. And there was another series broadcast in 2015 called The Jewish Quarter, or Harat al-Yahud, and it focuses on Egyptian Jews' lives in the late 1940s and accuses the Muslim Brotherhood specifically of being the main conspirator against the Jewish interests in Egypt. However, the series was attacked by several Arabic outlets, media outlets outside Egypt, for being nothing but, and I'm quoting, deposit for a new friendship with the Zionist state after Sisi became president. In fact, to discredit a religious or political opponent in the region, it's enough to allude to the opponent's often imaginary Jewish origin, as I mentioned in one of the series, but actually it applies in practice. So following the 2013 coup in Egypt, the political opposition includes the Brotherhood, claimed that al-Sisi's mother was a Moroccan Jew. And the irony is that similar rumors haunted the Brotherhood's founder, Hassan al-Banna, claiming that his origins were rooted in a Moroccan Jewish family. So here you go. And this anti-Semitic discourse hasn't diminished despite the Abraham Accords and the recent rapprochement with Israel. The leading Egyptian actor, Muhammad Ramadan, for instance, was heavily criticized lately, in fact in 2020, on social media platforms after posting a photograph of himself with an Israeli singer while both were in Dubai. Ramadan was accused of treason and promoting cultural normalization with Israel, and the Egyptian General Federation of Arts Syndicates suspended his membership temporarily to investigate the matter. So the religious and political discourses played a role in shaping the myth of the hateful Jews. It was disseminated via entertainment industry while disconnecting, or thereby disconnecting, Arab Jewry from the Arab region. And the insistence that the Arabs' dispute with Israel is related to the Zionist ideology and not targeted at Jews or Judaism is, as Bernard Lewis says, is fatally undermined by the hatred commonly expressed in Arabic books, newspapers, magazines, and even school textbooks in many parts of the region. Zionism in such a culture context means that Jews and Israelis are used interchangeably and without much effort to define either term. And the irony is that many Arab communities and states object to the misrepresentation of Arabs and Muslims in Western discourse, such as in War on Terror initiative, in which Arabs and Muslims are usually the usual suspect. But as we know, anti-Semitism as a hateful discourse may begin with the Jews, but never ends with the Jews. Thank you.
That was quite wonderful. Next time you can add something on Gal Gadot and the Israeli who was banned from trying to play the part of Cleopatra. And of course, Omar Sharif, who was punished for performing with Barbra Streisand. So this is really a deep and an important topic. Okay. Our next speaker is from Tel Aviv University. Joel Parker is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies. His research focuses on Syria and Lebanon in the 20th century and on the Syrian Civil War. He's published several articles and is currently researching Syrian Jewish history in the late 1940s. The title of his talk is State-Level Incitement Against Zionism on the Eve of the Aleppo Pogrom of 1947.
Thank you, thank you. It's good to see friendly faces here. Just 1 second. I'm a bit overwhelmed. I've had so much to think about already. What's going on? No, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay. Why isn't it? Okay, there we go. So a bit of background, I guess. Let me just go forward. I was initially really interested in this subject. I am still very interested in this subject, and I was interested namely in the events themselves, the Aleppo riots of 1947, which I'll talk about a bit more. And I owe a debt of gratitude to the works of Norman Stillman and Harel Yaron and other people who've written specifically about the Aleppo riots. I think, perhaps unfortunately, I wasn't able to uncover a lot of new information that I had never, that isn't known basically about the riots themselves. However, I think, so I'm kind of playing it down, but I think in the end I did come to the conclusion that it's important to try and, I think there's a big project that hasn't been done yet of weaving together sort of Jewish history and typical Middle Eastern history. And that's something that I kind of figured out was that in traditional Middle Eastern history books, there's almost no mention of things that relate to the Jews of the Middle East. And in some of the history of the Jews of the Middle East, there's not enough, in my opinion, context that draws on the literature of Middle Eastern history in general. So there's a kind of gaps on both sides that I think does deserve to be re-examined and woven together with perhaps new revelations stemming from that weaving of these two sides together. So that's my kind of big conclusion in the end, and so I'll go into the details a little bit more now. My main sources were the available U.S. and British archives, as well as French archives, but not as much for this period. Hebrew scholarship, as well as the Palmach archives, which I'm still kind of hoping to get more into. A lot of Arabic memoirs exist, as well as some literature on Aleppo in Arabic. News archives, there are tons of newspaper archives from the period. This period already has a lot of, a pretty rich texture of articles. Even the New York Times and various, English language newspapers were publishing on the events in question. And as I mentioned, Norman Stillman and Yaron Harel wrote a lot about the actual riots themselves. So basically the historiographical problem was what now kind of interests me going forward, because what I noticed initially when I was trying to find information in the regular books on Syrian history about the Aleppo riots, I thought there must be something here or something there, and there's almost nothing really, and it's for several reasons. One being that there's a very sharp, periodization divide between everything that happened before 1946 and everything that happened basically after 1949. There's kind of the new Syria was post-1949, and the pre-Syria was the Mandate period and earlier. So there's this weird gap that's basically 1946 to 1949, where very few people have actually delved deeply into what was going on in Syria. It was a bit of an upheaval period. Syria had just gained independence. The British and French had just left after World War II. And in general, there wasn't a lot there wasn't a lot yet to say, because the political constellation of Syrian politics was just forming. And of course, it's well before the Ba'ath Party and all of that, so which interests a lot of people who are interested in contemporary Syria. Anyway, to make a long story short, this event was just essentially ignored, and I also found an attitude going way back to the founder, of a lot of contemporary 1960s, 70s, 80s works on Syria was, Albert Horani, who wrote about almost everything in his time. in his book on the minorities in the Arab lands, wrote, "Most Jewish minorities in Syria are of no great importance. Thus, the Jews in Damascus and Aleppo are small communities of craftsmen and traders, Arabic-speaking and externally assimilated. Many of them have immigrated to the New World in general and are becoming Europeanized quickly. Although for the most part they are not Zionists, Zionism has affected them. Very many of them have settled in Palestine, and those who are left cannot be wholly unaffected by the rising wave of Arab hostility to Zionism." And that was published by University of Oxford Press in 1947. So I think that's a sort of typical view that was carried on later into his students like Philip Khoury and even more recent writers like Keith Wattenpoe and Elizabeth Thompson, who've written excellent histories of Syria, but very little that actually is relevant to the Jewish communities. And around 1930, there were definitely around 30,000 Jews living in Syria, and in Aleppo itself there were over 20,000. So that was a pretty significant part of the population of Aleppo at the time. And while certainly, and this is where the other side probably has some gaps, is that histories of the Jews of the Middle East tend to sometimes gloss over the Syrian communities because they were not nearly as big as the community of like Baghdad or even Cairo or Morocco or North Africa had many more Jews in terms of numbers. When we talk about 800,000 Jews around, who were in the Arab lands around 1940, the Syrian population was, in fact, a small group of that. But that being said, there's another problem with the Syrian Jewish community, which being that a large part of it did not immigrate to Israel, so they didn't become a central part of the Zionist narrative either. The Zionist narrative tends to focus a little bit more on the Jews of Baghdad, who came in huge numbers from 1948 to 1952. So the Syrian Jews, because a lot of them already had established communities abroad in the 1800s, like in Buenos Aires and New York and other places, they weren't Zionists for the most part. And that's actually, Albert Harani, I think, is reflecting, from what I understand, a fairly accurate view of at least for sure would have been true in the 1930s. By his actual time period, 1947, there probably were more, at least closet Zionists among the Syrian Jewish community, but that's something we don't know because they were closet Zionists, not, out waving the flag or something. So anyway, there's three moving parts to the whole story that I was looking at in my paper. One was in order to contextualize this, what was happening, the Syrian polity was going through rapid change. As I mentioned, it was the independence. Had just started. They had fresh elections in 1947. They were actually creating some of their basic laws regarding elections in that year. And as I mentioned, one of the things that's also overlooked a lot and actually tends to be something we need to I would like to see put back into scholarship a little bit is how the religious leaders of the community were in fact very important leaders in the community. And so the Halabi, the Aleppian community was very tied to the rabbinical establishment in Jerusalem, and there was a lot of actual, the ties were so strong that it actually affected a lot of social interactions. And that was not just for the Syrian Jews in Halab, but also in Aleppo, but also the Syrian Jews, of course, in Brooklyn and other places. They were very tied to the rabbinical establishment, well, even to some extent to the present day, but for sure back in that time period. So the Zionist activity, which is relevant because it was on the rise, and I don't have time to go into all of it. There was the Palmach, was the secret covert brigade that was created in coordination with the British. Initially, it was actually a wing of the British forces that were designed to prevent a Nazi takeover of the Levant, and so they trained a bunch of Jewish members of the Yeshuv, Zionists essentially, who were able to kind of covertly go into Syria, and their job was to disrupt the infrastructure so that the Free French and Syrian and British troops could invade, basically, and take over what had happened was that the French forces, if you don't know, after the Nazis invaded France and took over, a lot of the French colonial empire basically went immediately over to the side of the Vichy French, some of them actively so. And that was the case in the Levant. So the Free French, led by Charles de Gaulle, and the British together invaded, and took them a while actually. Essentially, it wasn't so bloody, but it was intense. They were able to kind of wrest the Levant from the Vichy French power. And that was actually, interestingly enough, that was with some help from the undercover Jewish agents of the Palmach, which actually then, once the British realized they didn't need them anymore, the Palmach kind of regrouped and reorganized and became an anti-British militia, which was quite fascinating because the transformation was really 180 degrees. They became very anti-British because the British at that time were preventing the Jewish refugees from Europe from making Aliyah, from coming to Israel. So the Palmach was actually redesigned entirely to help Jewish immigration from Syria and Lebanon to come to Israel. So they became, they actually had to figure out how to essentially bypass the British authorities. Anyway, so the Syrians started realizing this, and they weren't fully aware of all the underground stuff that was going on. In fact, as far as I know, nobody fully knows every detail of what was going on underground at that time. But the Syrians who were started to get aware of what was happening started making, it was really late actually, it was 1947, only after they became independent, they were able to make anti-Zionist laws for the first time. So, and I have some documents about that. I think I go forward and then backwards. So there was the new radical elites were able to create this law that was that mandated hard labor for anyone who sells or facilitates the sale of his or other people's real estate in Palestine or to the Zionists directly or indirectly. Anyone who smuggles or helps smuggle Jews into Palestine, either by mediation, sheltering, or any other means of assistance, et cetera, et cetera. This was promoted by Akram al-Harani and his sidekick, Hani al-Sibai, they had founded the Hama Youth, which was basically like a kind of nationalist militia. I won't call them fascist, even though they probably were semi-fascist. And they basically were the first people to they were the youngsters in the parliament, and they passed this law. Let's see, it passed without any modification on May 16th, 1947. And and anyway, what was interesting was that the old guard was kind of caught off guard a little bit with when there was diplomatic pressure against this law. Zionist rabbi in New York wrote to basically to the American delegation saying this isn't okay, that the Syrians are, at that time the rumor that had reached America was that the Syrians had enacted a death sentence to anyone helping Jews, to Jews helping refugees. I think it is possible that there was some kind of an unspoken rule that if a Jew was caught helping Jewish refugees escape to Palestine, it would have been not good. But in terms of Syrians helping, it was just labor in prison with a labor camp. Anyway, Jamil Maldambé was the prime minister, and he vigorously denied racial discrimination against Jews, that racial discrimination against Jews exists in Syria, and say that Syrian Jews consider themselves Syrians first of all. But he added, however, I'm going back up to the middle here, that does not mean we tolerate Zionism. Our policy towards Zionist infiltration is directed by decisions of the Arab League. And that's, I think, this internal contradiction among the old guard. I'm running out of time here. So the old guard is the kind of people who signed the Franco-Syrian Treaty in 1936, and these guys were largely shaped by the French kind of attitude, which was very aggressive at protecting minorities. In fact, one of the reasons the French had used to justify their own continued occupation of Syria was that if we leave, then these Muslims are going to start killing the Christians, they're going to start killing the Jews, everybody's going to get killed around here by the Muslim majority. And so these old guard, that was one of their jobs, was to make sure that that didn't happen. Now the younger group was inspired more by guys like Saad al-Jabri, and Saad al-Jabri actually interestingly passed away in June 1947. He in fact had been earlier, and according to French intelligence, he had been allied with Italy. He was in fact very close to the Axis powers in World War II. And he was more of a rabble-rouser. He had actually been part of kind of an anti-French guerrilla warfare in the 1920s. So he had the credentials that a lot of younger people looked up to him as kind of like the guy they would want to aspire to be. So he, even though he was only a little bit younger than the old guard, and even though he died, he inspired, I think, a lot of the popular kind of sentiment in Syria. And what we can see was the result was that the riots destroyed over $2.5 million worth of Jewish property, and they targeted mainly Jewish symbols. Now that, I think, we could attribute that to local culture of some sort, but obviously it's, this is taken from the Bible Museum, but literally, like, if you look at the Kristallnacht and what happened in Kristallnacht in 1938, we actually see is somewhat of a similar thing where the target was really the Jewish books and the Jewish culture, as well as Jewish property. In Kristallnacht, of course, many people were killed, but in Aleppo, actually, I think because of the old guard, they restrained the population from actually mass bloodshed. And in fact, so the echo was not one-to-one. It was an echo. It was maybe a faint echo, if you will, but there was certainly, I think, some kind of an echo from the fascist Nazi kind of era to this riot. And I spoke to a couple of people. If you know Rabbi Eli Abadi, who's really interesting. He was telling me the story of his mother, who heard people. He grew up. He wasn't in the riots, but he grew up hearing many stories from his mother, who was there. And she believed for her whole life that people were for sure murdered and raped, but again, we don't have a record of that, and I couldn't find any record of specific people who were killed in these riots. Another guy I got to speak to, well, I guess I didn't, let me see, did I not put it here? Anyway, I'll go to in a nutshell. Yeah, I'm going to wrap it up here. So anyway, other eyewitnesses that I spoke to basically described the local police directing and encouraging the riots, showing them where the Jewish property was, because not all the Jewish property had, other than the synagogues themselves, not all of it had, a sign out front saying, hey, we're Jews here. So there was a certain amount of organization that eyewitnesses describe. And it decimated, really, the century-old Jewish, and I didn't get into the whole history of the Jews of Aleppo, I don't have time, but it was a community that was established for well over 1,000 years, if not really even, according to them, 2,500 years. So, in any case, the Jewish community did end up leaving, but not all of them to Israel. Many of them chose to go to other Aleppan Jewish communities in, as I mentioned, North America, South America, and New York, which also a little bit doesn't jive fully well with the Zionist narrative that everybody just wanted to come to Israel and that was the place that everybody wanted to be. It's not exactly true for this community specifically. They had Israel was a good option. In fact, one of the things, and this is the kicker, where I interviewed an 87-year-old guy in Tel Aviv who told me that actually his parents wanted to stay in Aleppo. They didn't want to leave even after the riots. But when the government started talking about recruiting all males to fight against Israel, that was when his family, who was not at all Zionist, said, okay, forget that. We're not going to fight against the Zionists. Like, we may not like them, but we're not going to be on the other side of a war against them. So for them, like, having a Jewish identity meant no way, no how could we actually take up a gun and start fighting our Jewish brothers. So that was the shift that happened from the old guard to the young guard. A lot of things happening. In any case, the riots were probably also an echo of fascism in Europe, but had their own internal kind of dynamics going on there. Yeah.
Thank you. How wonderful to hear new material. A great talk. Just one comment. Much of this is inspired the Bernard Lewis Prize, and he writes, was in 1986, Semites and Anti-Semites, and at the time complaining how little scholarship there was. Well, of course, he was right, that most of the scholarship in anti-Semitism focused upon Europe and very little on the Middle East. And how wonderful this panel is, because we have 2 graduate students getting their doctorate degrees. We have an established scholar and a very established scholar who, in the course of his career, began in Europe and has migrated to the Middle East, which indicates a welcome sign and a wonderful response to the call, not really a call, but the implicit call in Bernard Lewis's book. So our last speaker in this series is David Patterson, who holds the Feinberg Department's Distinguished Chair in Holocaust Studies at the University of North Texas at Dallas. He's a winner of the National Jewish Book Award and the Koret Jewish Book Award for his work on European Jewry. He's a Holocaust scholar, but he has come to publish more than 40 books and 250 essays or so. But his latest work is on anti-Semitism in the Middle East. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Ilan. So, from the beginning. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. Good morning. Most of you, perhaps, will recognize this image as one of the kites used to take incendiary devices from Gaza into Israel. I'm going to talk about, based on my book, A Genealogy of Evil, the genealogy of evil, anti-Semitism, in terms of parallels as well as influences from the Nazis to Hamas. Famously, both invoke the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols is more like a religious scripture than a historical document. And the Hamas Charter, you find that they invoke three kinds of proof texts to support their claims about the Jews and Israel. They invoke the Quran, texts from the Hadith, and Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The one important figure here, with certainly for Hamas, is Hassan al-Banna. Indeed, the Hamas Charter opens by quoting Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna is the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood from 1928, when he gathered together a few men, half a dozen men, to establish the Muslim Brotherhood. Their motto, yes, the motto, Allah is our goal, the Prophet is our leader, Quran is our law, Jihad is our way, death in the service of Allah is our highest desire. I guess I'll do it that way. Okay. Now, I'm sorry to move so slowly here. Hassan al-Banna was familiar with some of the works of Hitler. Hitler had become quite notorious by 1928. He had published Mein Kampf a couple of years earlier. And al-Banna, in his writings, expresses an admiration for Hitler, particularly with regard to Hitler's understanding of propaganda. As you know, Hitler discusses propaganda, the importance of propaganda, at some length in Mein Kampf, where he explains that the aim of propaganda is certainly not to inform, nor even to persuade, but to incite what he calls wrathful hatred. Zorniges Hass, wrathful hatred. And by 1935, al-Banna had a propaganda division operating with the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, Hitler is famous for saying that something of the most insidious lie will always stick. And Bernard Lewis, indeed, in his book, Semite and Anti-Semite, writes about some of the examples of the propaganda over the years, where he says Jews are, in Egyptian propaganda, Jews are claimed to infect girls with AIDS and syphilis and send them to Egypt to infect the population. They're accused of supplying Egyptian women with hyper-aphrodisiac chewing gum and deliberately spreading cancer among the Egyptians and other Arabs by devising and disseminating carcinogenic cucumbers and shampoo. They promote drug trade, devil worship. They want to legalize homosexuality to undermine Egyptian society. And these are examples that Bernard Lewis offers. In other words, it's not that all Jews are evil, but that all evil is Jewish. So in this case, for the jihadists, this is a difference. For the Nazis, the extermination of the Jews was a grim necessity. For the jihadists, it's a religious duty. You can't be regarded as one among the righteous if you're not part of the jihadist program. And the jihadists, the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, they see an ally in Hitler. They sent delegations to Nuremberg rallies. In 1938, at a conference convened by the Brotherhood in Cairo, they gave out texts, not the whole text, but texts from Mein Kampf and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, a key figure in the connection here is Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, already referenced, and I'm grateful to my colleagues for preparing some of this ground for me. Al-Husseini paid his first visit to Heinrich Wolf, the new German consul in Jerusalem, on March 31st, 1933. Hitler had come to power just 2 months earlier. And he immediately began establishing a relationship with the Nazi regime. The Nazis assisted him in the matter of the Arab revolt. Al-Husseini was already known as one who would incite violence, and indeed, in October 1937, he had to flee Palestine, wanted for the crime of inciting the revolt. And he had material support from the Nazis. From Palestine, a couple of years later, he ended up in Iraq on April 3rd, 1941, again with material aid from the Nazis. He was part of a coup against the Iraqi government, which was backed by the British. By the end of May, the British had, suppressed the coup, and Haj Amin al-Husseini once again was on the run, but not before he incited the riot against the Jews in Baghdad, known as the Farhud. Several hundred Jews were killed, businesses were destroyed. From Baghdad, by a circuitous route, he went to Tehran, to Rome, finally ended up in Berlin, where he had his first meeting with Hitler on November 28th, 1941. In his memoirs, he writes the following with regard to that meeting. He says, "Our fundamental condition for cooperating with Germany was a free hand to eradicate every last Jew from Palestine and the Arab world. I asked Hitler for an explicit undertaking to allow us to solve the Jewish problem in a manner befitting our national and racial aspirations. And according to the scientific methods innovated by Germany, and the answer I got was, the Jews are yours." Now, al-Husseini, soon after meeting with Hitler, met with Eichmann, other Nazi leaders. The one with whom he worked most closely was Heinrich Himmler. And he worked with the SS, and Himmler and the head of the SS, of course, doing radio broadcasts in Arabic language. He had 6 radio stations that would send broadcasts to North Africa and East He was also notorious for recruiting Muslim killing units, the most infamous of which was the 13th Hanshar Division, organized in February 1944, operating in the Balkans. Most of the Muslims in these divisions were not Arabs. I've seen numbers as high as 100,000 recruited, that he recruited for these SS divisions. This sounds frankly a little high to me. The Hanshar Division had more than 21,000, however. As a result of these activities with the Nazis, Haj Amina Husseini was on the list of war criminals and had to flee once again. He turned up in Cairo on June 20th, 1946, to a hero's welcome. He was hailed as a great jihadist by Hassan al-Banna. Hitler himself was referred to as one who was undertaking a jihad. In the Arabic language edition of Mein Kampf, which was translated by Louis al-Hajj, a former Nazi converted to Islam, al-Hajj refers to Hitler in his introduction as one who had undertaken a jihad against the Jews. So you have this interweaving of Nazi and jihadist discourse. Of course, another important figure here is Sayyid Qutb, probably the single most influential ideologue to come out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Qutb, in his short book, long essay called Our Struggle with the Jews, takes on this kind of Nazi-like discourse. He says there that the Jews are, by nature, in their essence, determined to fight Allah's truth, and they are the blackest source of the worst anti-Islamic machinations. The Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg declared that what is poisoning us, the Aryan Geist, is not Jewish blood, it's Judaism, because the ism is in the blood. Therefore, every Jew has to be eliminated. Every Jew will test positive for Judaism. To free the world of this contagion, you have to free the world of the Jewish people. There's no distinction between Jewish people and Judaism here. One of Qutb's most ardent admirers was Ahmed Yassin, who would become the founder of Hamas. Hamas founded in December 1987 with the slogan that killing Israelis is an act of devotion. An act of devotion. It's like prayer. This is how you ascend to a higher level with God. By killing Israelis. Jewish blood is your ticket to paradise. As Haj Amina Husseini repeatedly said, killing Jews is pleasing to Allah. It will guarantee you a place in heaven. And just a couple of examples of the language of the charter of Hamas, which is the charter of Allah, right? Hamas is Allah. You see that the Jews are a source of corruption. They destroy values, they deteriorate character, and it's not the alcoholism, drug trade, and it's Israel, Judaism, and Jews. These are one and the same. They are of a piece. You can't separate Israel from Judaism, Judaism from Jews on this view. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the proof text invoked in the charter, the sacred texts invoked are Quran, Hadith, and protocols of the elders of Zion. Proof that they want to expand is to be found in the protocols. Now, what are the ramifications? As the Jews are demonized, they are rendered as invisible as Satan and as threatening, as ominous, as ubiquitous. Victory can come only when the jihadists rule all of humanity. The jihadists are here to save you from the Jews, from that evil, from the evil that will destroy you. Like the Nazi war against the Jews, the jihadist war it's far more than a war against the Zionist entity. It's politics, sociology, ideology, all of these are in play, of course, but the phenomenon is not reducible to that, I would argue. It has a metaphysical dimension. As Muhammad Hussein Yaqub reminds us from a radio broadcast in 2009 in Egypt, he says, if the Jews left Palestine to us, would we start loving them? The Jews are infidels, not because I say so, but because Allah says so. They're enemies not because they occupy Palestine. They would have been enemies if they did not occupy a thing. Our fighting with the Jew is eternal, until not a single Jew remains on the face of the earth. And this in the name of God. Okay? There's no redemption without this fight. There's no entry into the upper realms without engaging in this fight. Now, among the last words Hitler wrote was to enjoin the world to, quote, resist mercilessly the poisoner of all nations, international Jewry, which he wrote hours before he committed suicide. He's calling upon the world to carry on this fight against evil. It's not for territory. It's not for military ascendancy. It's not, it isn't political. It's metaphysical, seems to me. And those who have most fervently, most enthusiastically, most passionately heeded that plea, I would argue, are the Islamic jihadists. Systematic, devoted, ready to die. Thanks so much.